We didn't even do anything yet.
They already like us.
Hi, welcome to our talk. Today, we want to introduce you to the hierarchy of being in VR.
We hope that you leave here today with a new perspective of the power that you have as VR creators to inspire and to affect people.
My name is Yelena Rachitsky, and for the past decade, I've been enabling storytellers to create meaningful and emotionally impactful experiences for people. And I remember that the first time I tried VR, the thing that really got me into it is that I was finally able to experience storytelling with my entire body and not just my mind.
And my name is Isabel Tewes, and I've always found it really interesting, thank you, that different technologies and new digital products find new ways to connect us with each other. The first time that I tried VR, I sketched in Tilt Brush, and much like Yelena, I found it so amazing that I could actually use my body gestures, my entire body, to all of a sudden create art that I could stand in the middle of. Why is it that VR, which is a technology that engages our entire body, make us feel so different? Both of us have worked in the industry now for a while, and we still feel that way. So today, we wanted to explore that question. First, we wanted to understand the body, the physiology, the psychology, the sociology, these concepts behind it. And so we spoke and read the works of a ton of academics and researchers and experts. But really, it's also the artists that get these concepts to people. And so we wanted to get a sense of how these ideas are brought to life, and we spoke to content creators that are making VR today. Thank you so much for everyone, some of you in the room, that gave us your time.
Thank you. And in talking to these two groups, we realized how important these ideas are for each other. So as content creators, in order to create for VR, you really need to understand concepts around the human body. And this is something that academia tells us. If you think about it for a second, we are who we are today, and we see the way that we see because what our full bodies and minds have experienced collectively. You know that when you bang your knee, it's going to hurt, or Isabel knows when she reaches out her arm how far it's going to extend. And you know that those seats that you're sitting in will hold you. We also know how to communicate most of the time, but in VR, we're mostly brand new. The same rules we've taken all of our lives to learn, they don't necessarily apply. I think we're all guilty of acting a little bit differently.
So for example, I don't usually walk into my friend's house and start poking their stuff and grabbing everything and throwing it around.
I do.
Most of us don't. But in VR, we're all guilty of wanting to grab things and throw them and break them. And what does that remind you of?
It reminds us a little of this. Here's Mako, and he's 3 years old. He's very cute. The world is his playground. All of us are extremely sophisticated and complex adults, I'm sure. But when we go into VR, we kind of act like kids again.
And just like kids, we're starting to build up our expectations. Maybe we don't have enough experiences to know exactly what to expect. So we grab things and we poke and we prod, and we're trying to find out exactly what the reaction will be. And once we find out, we create a new memory, and that goes and becomes a future expectation. This perceptual response cycle is actually happening over and over again for us subconsciously every day. It shapes how we act in the world. So let's try this for 1 second.
So what do you see when you look at this? You probably didn't see this. But when you look back at this again, you have no doubt what that picture was. We all created a new memory together. Many of us have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that states that in order to reach fulfillment, we first need to meet our basic needs, and that starts with things like food and sleep, and it goes all the way up from there to fun things like creativity and spontaneity. You must fulfill the first before you start worrying about the second. So we're all starting with the basics, and this takes us up to the more fulfilling stuff. So how can we apply this to VR?
Well, today we want to talk to you about the hierarchy of being in VR. We also want to start with the basics. We want to go up to the more fulfilling stuff. The first thing that you have to do is you have to establish a sense of self. Then you build upon that, and you create a context of your environment. And only then can you start connecting with others. These are the building blocks that make us feel virtually present. And today we're going to stick to this hierarchy, and we're going to use this structure alongside examples from academics and from content creators to bring it to life.
There's 3 places that we think it's important to focus on to start achieving this sense of self. And that starts with our body ownership, our connection to avatars, and then also how that affects our behavior. In order to feel connected, we need to feel like we have ownership over ourselves, understand who we are, why we're here. We need our physical bodies to embody that virtual avatar. So how do we sync our physical bodies to our virtual ones? There's this now classic example. It's the rubber hand experiment. Some of you might have heard about it. A researcher came and picked a subject, and he put a fake arm, a rubber hand, in the eyesight of the subject and put the real hand in a place where he couldn't see. Then the researcher started tickling both the fake hand and the real hand at the same time and at the same pace. Then they started to only tickle the rubber hand. And what happened was that the participant felt like his real hand was being tickled, even though it wasn't. Then they threatened the fake hand. Boom. And the participant actually jerked back in fear. He was affected by the synchrony and movement. And when this was done and it was not in sync, he didn't actually feel this actually didn't work. So this is pretty incredible. But how much body do we need in order to feel like it's our own?
Well, researchers in Japan tried just this by putting someone in a headset with 2 different conditions. In one, they could see their hands and feet only, and otherwise an invisible body. And in the second scenario, this beautiful avatar body in front of them, also in the third person. In both cases, their own physical movements were actually mirrored virtually. And because of what we just talked about in the rubber hand experiment, that synchrony of the movement made them believe the avatar was theirs. But here's the really fascinating part, is that in both the scenario with a full body or the scenario with just the gloves and the feet, there was no statistical difference of how connected that person felt. And that's really interesting, because we assume that you need that as much virtually as possible. But that's not what they found out. We found out that the most important part, actually, is this.
The improbability of synchrony occurring by chance, it overrides all other information, even the knowledge that an invisible body cannot be yours, which we saw with both the rubber hand example and the Japanese research. Our mind is fully equipped to fill in these gaps.
Now look at what our community has done, what you guys have done. These are some of the hands that you can try out in VR. And as we all know here, it's just really a small sample. You've done an incredible job of taking that presence of hands and helping people connect to these identities. Sure, they're not lifelike, but they match to our movements, and we begin to feel like they're ours. You might not be aware of it, but when we step into VR, we do this thing where we look at our hands and you wiggle your fingers and you kind of get accustomed to your new avatar self. And this moment is called registration. Now, of course, I'm not a skeleton and I'm looking at skeleton hands, but even if they don't look human, you can actually quickly connect with them. In fact, they don't have to look human at all.
Jaron Lanier, who many of you have probably heard of, he coined a term called homuncular flexibility. He put people in the virtual body of a lobster with 8 limbs. He wanted to see, can a human control a non-human body? People are tool makers and they're users. And what Lanier found is that we as humans, we have the ability to learn and control bodies that are completely different than our own. And this is done through tricks like seeing yourself in a mirror or something mirroring you. You can begin to control non-human body parts or an extra one, like the extra limbs of a lobster. This really opens up the possibilities of what bodies you can create for people in VR.
The team from within really took this to the next level in Life of Us, where two people experience evolution just over a few minutes, where they move from an amoeba to a fish. Then later on, you turn into a monkey, and then a dinosaur, like this, with your tiny T-Rex arms. I love this one. And later on, you even take on the persona of a human in New York. And I've lived in New York, and it's very stressful, and it reminded me a lot of this, actually. This is homuncular flexibility at work. Through mimicry, you can actually learn how to use different bodies. And here you do it over and over again, and it feels completely natural. What you see as yourself is actually what you start to become. So how does this affect us? The thing that Life of Us shows is that people can take the form or the shape of whatever it is that you're giving them. Through mimicry or through mirroring, they'll embody a dinosaur, a monkey, an amoeba. If you change their avatars, they actually can change their behavior.
And experiments show that people will unconsciously alter their behavior to conform to that of an avatar that they inhabit, and that's pretty powerful. Just like when a cat looks at itself in the mirror and sees itself as a lion, how do you think it's going to act?
I said I wouldn't do that.
And this was tested through something called the Proteus effect, and there's been a few examples. But one of them was people self-chose what they considered an attractive avatar. And when they felt attractive, they actually felt much more confident in choosing other attractive avatar mates. The opposite was true when someone chose what they considered an unattractive avatar. They were affected by their experience of the embodiment of that avatar.
And this sounds really complicated, but it doesn't have to be. Even outside of VR, something like Instagram AR effects, you're physically altering your body to conform to that visual effect. Generally speaking, my friend Drew doesn't howl at me, but if you put puppy dog ears on him, he just might.
And my dad doesn't usually look like Dr. Seuss up there, but he is a good sport.
So as creators, you can make embodiment fun and light and very silly.
But you can also shift perspective about others by body swapping. This is a piece from Machine to Be Another by Be Another Lab. And they actually had people in headsets, and they had a live stream of the opposite view of each person. So when you look down at your hands, what you see is the other person. And when your hands are in sync, you start to believe that body is yours. When you start touching your legs, you start to feel like those legs are yours. And this is extremely powerful when it's someone who's a different race than you and a different gender, or someone with opposing views. This can begin to start building empathy, and your behavior changes towards that person.
So connecting with the self is foundational, and we covered how you can do that by looking at body ownership, avatar connection, and the behavioral effects of these. As creators, you have to remember that how you build the self is how people will feel about themselves, and therefore how they might act. And now that we have an understanding of ourselves, we need to understand where we are. Remember that our connection to the world, it's what gives us context. It affects how we feel, and it might also affect how we behave. So today we're going to break it down into 3: body and space, the objects that are found within that space, and the behavior that those cause.
So what does it mean to have a body in space? Space creates the rules for what you feel and what you do, and similar to this conference center that we went to, behavior is everyone walking in here and listening to people like us talk, and, and something similar. And architects have been thinking about this for a long time. They think about how bodies move through the structures that they create. If you create something that has a lot of large scale and huge scale, it can give a sense of awe. Color can affect your mood. It can make you cheerful or mellow. And texture and shape can create a feeling of comfort or discomfort. And light, especially, can make a big impact. So darker light can be intimate, can keep you constrained to a smaller space, while brighter light creates a space of more optimism, and emotions are more intense. In a study, when subjects were in brighter light, they actually started feeling more positive.
And even long ago, you think before we had industrial structures, spaces have always made us feel a certain way. Hunters and gatherers of the Paleolithic age recognized that in a cave, they were safe. So that was a territory that was associated with safety and with shelter, especially in contrast to a big open land where you were left vulnerable. Or a holy place like cathedrals are constructed to also evoke a certain feeling. You have really smooth walls. The place seems to almost glow. There's no direct light pointed at you. The ceilings are always high, and that makes you feel really small. You're in the presence of the sublime, and you know it. You understand that this is a place that's meant for contemplation.
And in VR, Wolves on the Walls by Fable Studios, which is based on a Neil Gaiman book, you play Lucy's imaginary friend, and that's Lucy. And Fable Studios was incredibly deliberate in constructing the space specifically to help her. They play with theatrical techniques like lighting and vignette and spotlight in order to draw your attention. And the sets are all theatrically revealed very gradually in order to introduce you to the environment. But this only happens after you've had a chance to connect with Lucy. They also took inspiration from Bruce Bloch, where color, shape, pacing, and scale informed the emotional impact of each environment and each character. She has her brother, her mom, her dad, and they all had a different color to them. So every character, and by extension, each environment, has a unique color and shape and language based on the character.
In VR, you can place anyone anywhere. You're able to create what you want the body to do in whatever space it is that you make. So looking to concepts like architecture, set design, and immersive theater is really important because it's the things that are familiar to us in our everyday life. We kind of know what to expect in the real world, and we can use that. And you can build a place like they did in Wolves in the Walls that's a little bit familiar, or you can take those concepts and go completely ham, like Tyler Hurd does. And these are completely new spaces. I've never been somewhere where the mountains are dancing behind me. And yet, you can recognize those concepts that we just talked about, the color and the brightness, the scale that he uses to evoke a certain feeling. It's a feeling that he called dumb joy, which is not a word, but it should be a word. When you look at this, you can't help but feel like happy and light and like maybe you want to dance. Your identity, you want to dance?
I always want to dance.
Your identity is established by your avatar, and your environment sets the tone and the rules of your behavior. So you get it. This is a positive space, and you should be really engaged. Once you've established your environment, the world that you want to build, then you get to start bringing in objects that help us connect with that world that you've built. So the stuff in the virtual world, the things that we're holding with our hands, or it feels like we're holding with our hands, are our way to physically connect with that setting. In VR, the objects we're holding, they become almost like an extension of ourselves.
And when we're given hands in VR, like Lucy is giving us hands right now, it actually changes us from passive observers to active participants. It allows us to interact with the world, and usually that comes in the form of objects. Hand presence in VR is still being worked on, but when it first came, it was a complete game changer. And the next step is our interaction with objects. Facebook Reality Labs has done a lot of work on object believability, which can be broadly defined as the belief that a virtual object exists as a physical entity. The idea is that the less disconnect you have between real life and virtual life makes your brains believe that you're actually holding that object. And the connection with objects is based on our expectations of real life, like we saw with that perception cycle. The challenge, of course, is that VR creates new and updated expectations. So we have to really think about taking cues from real life, and because we can't fully, we have to be extremely consistent in the choices that we make. What's challenging, though, is that what we're actually holding is touch controllers. So how do we believe that we're picking up toys or that Polaroid camera that Lucy's giving us? We found some creators approaching this in a really interesting way.
So one of the examples that we really like is Lone Echo from Ready at Dawn, which takes one certain approach. They actually lean into your interaction with the objects, and they make great use of the objects that are found in the space. They do great things with design around your hands and all the walls, all of the objects around you. They make it intricate, and they try for almost like this realism that's really believable. If you follow your hands as they touch everything, they rest, they push, they pull things, that makes a huge difference to you when you're in the game. Although you're physically holding touch controllers, yes, when you see your virtual hands making all these intricate movements and forming around the objects, you believe that they're there. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, Torn takes a different approach. Designing these intricate hands takes a lot of time and resources. You have to get it exactly right. So in Torn, what they did is that they actually use that synchrony that we talked about a little bit earlier, and every time you reach for an object, what happens to your hands is that they vanish. So this is a different way to take it, but you still really feel connected because the time that it happens matches your physical movements.
And what we found is that people really love very simple interactions. That object believability threshold, it's much lower. In Job Simulator, you press these big buttons, you pick up cartoony objects, your hands are big as well, unlike mine. Your brain easily believes these interactions, and it's incredibly rewarding. It also brings out that inner child. So once we have object believability, we have to understand that what we put on our hands actually changes the way that we behave. So for instance, when you're holding a butterfly, you feel much more gentle. When you're picking up a toy, you can feel much more silly. When there's a target shooter, you can be more focused, competitive, and a little toy rocket makes you slightly more aggressive. It's important to remember the responsibility you have as creators for the objects that you place.
So we started with how space can affect your feelings and your disposition, and then how the objects within the space change how you act depending on what it is that you do and what they're meant to do. So are you starting to see a little bit how these things can actually affect your behavior? Going back to the world of architecture, this is a quote that we really loved by Winston Churchill that says, "We make our buildings, and afterwards they make us." They regulate the course of our lives, and I think this is particularly true in VR. Whether you're thinking of buildings that are made in real life like a cathedral, or natural spaces like caves that are meant to provide safety, remember that spaces and structures make us. They determine our behavior.
This became clear with Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in the 1960s. It was their battle around New York. They both loved the city so much, and they wanted a better city design, but they had different ideas about what that meant. For Moses, it was about a functional city. He wanted a plan for density. So he wanted to put an expressway through Washington Square Park, which Jane Jacobs vehemently opposed. She thought cities should be about people's well-beings and the happiness of their citizens. There should be places for people to congregate. So she opposed the expressway, and thankfully she won because we still have that. And you really need both. You need a place that's functional, you need it to work, but you also need places for people to come together.
Earlier today, you might have seen this clip from Orbis, and they took a really interesting approach that kind of touches upon this concept. They built a village where people can gather. Quest lines and the environments are all designed so that you actually can see people and you run into each other as you're out doing things in the world. When we spoke to Riley, he mentioned the word serendipity. His hope is that as you passed each other, in VR, your natural inclination would be, once you see their body, you see they're having trouble figuring something out, that you would stop and help them along the way. And this mentorship and this friendship is actually really evident if you've ever played this game. Decisions like that on how you build your world and where you place the self can affect how people behave in VR. And spaces help set up those ground rules. So we talked about the self, and then the self in relationship to space and objects. And now we want to talk to you about how you can connect with others.
And in order to connect with others, you first have the two other parts of the hierarchy, the self and the world. And then within others, what we want to focus on is communication, so the way people communicate with each other, how you guide people to help them connect, and how these influences the way that people behave towards each other, if you're starting to see that connection. It's really easy to take for granted the nuances of our everyday communication, but it's also important to take into account the different ways that we communicate with each other these days. In all honesty, very little of it is face-to-face, and we infer really big meanings from things like GIFs and emojis. And I don't know about you, but a lot of my group messaging chats are probably like 40% GIFs. On tough days,
Higher.
probably a little bit higher.
But in fact, communication, it's a big word, and it's not just one thing. These are some of the factors. There's many, many more that we're constantly reading to try to understand each other. Oftentimes, we might misunderstand each other. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room that has ever been misinterpreted, or the way that you act might be misread. Was it because maybe someone didn't get your body language, or the cultural connotation wasn't the same? This happens all the time. And recreating every aspect of communication is really hard. In VR, one of the places where we're starting to break ground is trying to read facial expressions, not in the consumer tech, but it's one place where tech is really making headway, as you saw in Abrash's talk this morning. Facial expressions is something that we're very wired to read all of the time.
And like in Abrash's talk, you see that teams at Facebook and Oculus are doing incredible jobs at reaching this realism and avatar representation, especially these small nuances. And it's actually really, really hard to tell which one are the two. I know he told you this morning. So it's great, but we're also not there yet, especially when it comes for consumers. We think of it as the role of artists to take what we know and the technology that we have today to be able to create meaningful, emotional connections.
So one example that we like to use is the game Journey. How many people here have played Journey before? OK. I think you're all in the front. I love it. So in Journey, you travel a vast world, and you serendipitously meet other players who help you along the way. Genova Chen said something interesting. He said they wanted to represent and reflect the player's true nature. And what that meant for him is that they didn't want to show any personality or any features that could be possibly misled. You didn't want that possibility of misleading another player. So they took a minimalist approach to their avatars as a whole, but they also took a minimalist approach to something else, which was the communication style that they used in the game. If you've never played it, you might not be able to tell, but these two are actually players that are communicating with each other, because singing was the only way that you could try to understand what the other person wanted. You could control how long you did it for and how quickly it happened, but that was it. That was the only way that you could try to understand each other. And that's amazing. That kind of constraint created a lot of connections among people. In fact, when we asked people what games they had emotional connections to and what avatars they liked, Journey came up time and time again. And think about how constrained and how abstract they built it.
And in VR, Max Weisel takes a similar approach with normal chat. This is Wanda. Here she is saying hello. So she may be abstract, but she's also very emotive. Max points out that we've spent our whole lives reading facial expressions and body language. And like Isabel talked about, it's really unsettling when it doesn't work. So in normal chat, they avoided realism. And they were able to create this really cute and approachable feel, kind of like her noodly arms. And back here, Wanda's saying hello again. Hi, Wanda. The interactions are simple, but they feel real. The typing mechanism is also really easy to grasp. She's tapping with the percussion mallets. Your brain starts believing what your body is doing. Also, having written communication in VR can sometimes feel a little bit cold, but normal chat's finding a way to make it work and still be emotive.
We could also take inspiration around gestures. And this is a VR game from Polyarc called Moss, and in it, you meet a little companion named Quill, and she takes you all around the world and helps you solve puzzles along the way. It's an example of how simplicity and creativity can generate something that still feels very emotional. Now, people love Quill. They've been known, there's actually videos of people crying in the headset because they like her so much. And yet, the only way that you try to help understand each other, these blue orbs are your hands, and she waves back at you. You can pet her, and she likes it, until then she doesn't like it anymore, and she says, "Stop petting me." She helps you along the way. What's really impressive and really inspiring is that many of these are designed based on American Sign Language. So here's Quill introducing herself. She was animated by the talented Richard Lico, and he talks a lot about the simplicity of these gestures. What he said is that obviously you actually can't understand each other. You and Quill don't actually speak the same language. She can't talk back to you. And yet, in these small, sort of intricate but sort of simple gestures, you help and you communicate with each other, and you learn it pretty quickly.
Another great example in even further minimizing is Toy Box, and this is an older video. A friend once told us that they knew exactly who the other person was just by the way they moved their hands. So gesture and avatar representation, they allow us to communicate, but in a shared virtual space, what makes us feel connected to one another? There's a famous concept in psychology. It's called the chameleon effect. It highlights the power of unintentional mirroring. When we like each other, we have this natural tendency to imitate the other person's speech and expressions, which Isabel and I started doing all the time, which is a really interesting concept. So how can we relate this back to VR? Let's take a look at Rec Room.
So in Rec Room, you can do things like high-five each other, you can pump your fists in the air. Another big convention that they have is you can actually fist bump. And when you think about the chameleon effect, I think this idea of mirrored gestures between two people is really powerful. In real life, it makes us like each other, it makes us feel connected. In Rec Room, when I hold up my hand and Yelena is somewhere else doing the same thing, we see sparks fly and the controllers vibrate with a little bit of haptics. These visual cues and haptics, I think, leverage the chameleon effect so that it feels really rewarding. It actually feels like we're really connecting. Nick from Rec Room said, "We believe that the magic of VR is creating the experience of being in the same room as another person, even if they're thousands of miles away." And you heard a similar concept or idea from Boz this morning. That can feel really powerful. And the way that Against Gravity and Rec Room did that is by relying on these interactions of high fives, handshakes, fist bumps, sharing Polaroids, things that feel familiar to you that you're bringing from the real world and feel shared among two people.
So how do these methods of communication and these connective actions create the type of behaviors that we want to see?
Riley from Orbis said, "The more you encourage people to work together, the more will come back and keep playing to help each other out." And that's what they've seen, and it's what we've seen as well. Creating those connections for people inside of the experience that you build is really, really important. But you don't have to do it the same way. We actually see people approaching this in lots of different ways. You can encourage collaboration and world building like they do in Rec Room, or you can connect people through a little bit of friendly competition like in Echo VR, or you can set them off on a social narrative explorative journey like in Coco VR. Each of these have totally different ways that people connect with each other. In their own ways, they each foster connection, but it's a connection that feels true to what they've built. What's important is to start with the intention that you have as the creator. So let's go back to normal and to our friend Wanda, who here becomes Max. It's personalized, different colors. You can wear whatever hat you want, as you can tell. Max and the team have created a funky and friendly world. The space, like we talked about, it's intentionally cute and playful. You can see that it's really bright, like we talked about before. In turn, this makes you really friendly and playful with each other. This playfulness and creativity is part of what helps people connect.
And because virtually anything is possible, and like you just saw, our experiences together in VR are also extremely memorable. And creating these positive connective behaviors for people leads to really valuable memories. And these are some of the memories that we had with our friends in VR. Me and my colleagues going through Coco, can you guess which one I am?
The short one.
That's right, on the short one. Ari solving the escape room he created himself in Rec Room, and Isabel and Drew sharing photos in Facebook Spaces.
Do you remember Mako from a few minutes before? You can't forget Mako.
Can never forget Mako.
Well, just like Mako, we evolve in VR. The memories that we make shape our behaviors. We can go from throwing trains off of the desk and tossing everything around to creating meaningful connections with the world and with others. VR has the ability to shape us.
And you, as creators, determine how those behaviors are shaped. And our belief is that in order to create meaningful experiences, you have to start with the hierarchy of being. So as creators, you have to ask, when you're creating the self, that's the ground, that's the basics, how do you want people to feel about themselves and their connection to their bodies? And how will that make them behave?
And then when you're thinking about how you design the world, how does that space feel? And does it follow more function, or is it meant for gathering? Are you using the concepts that we just talked about earlier? How does what they hold, for example, the objects that they hold in their hands, how does that help determine their behavior? And when you start connecting them with others, what factors of communication do you rely on? Are you going towards realism or more of an abstraction? Are you creating the kind of behavior that you want to see? It's important to always go back to your intent as the creator.
And all of those questions get to the root of the hierarchy of being. And so we leave you with this. The more we understand the science behind how we work, the more meaningful we can make VR. And be intentional about the behaviors that you create. They will affect how people see themselves, their world, and others.
And remember, lastly, that we are almost brand new in VR. Childlike wonder is key. Always think of Mako. This has been a really fun and interesting talk for us to work on. Thank you so much for coming and for listening.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So here's where you can reach us and find us afterwards. And thank you so much for coming out here today, and have an amazing OC5.
We didn't shout out to Paul.